everyone. Welcome to the November membership meeting for Action Committee for Transit. It's been a very busy month, so I want to first thank everyone here, and for those who are watching at home, everyone who was able to attend our gala this past weekend. It was a very successful event, and seems like everyone had a really great time. So thank you again, especially for those who sponsored the event. And I also want to give a shout out to Kristen Blackman from the Bethesda Urban Partnership, who set up the bike parking right outside the venue so that people didn't need to park their bikes from a block away. I also want to thank those who attended the McDot event on Wednesday, which we co-sponsored with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. So if you have any additional feedback on Right On Reimagined, you can still submit that. There are some upcoming events. There is a toll lane public meeting tomorrow at the DoubleTree Hotel in Gaithersburg. So there was a meeting yesterday at Bethesda Chevy Chase, but if you weren't able to attend it, there's another one tomorrow from 6:30 to 8:30. We are also looking for members to join us in the Thanksgiving parade this weekend. So we are confirmed section F139, and if you're able to join, you'll be in our famed Purple Line costume. And so we need people to show up because we have a certain number of people are required so that we can be a train together. You can't have a train with only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people. So if you are able to attend, it's November 18th, and we will be meeting up first thing in the morning, and that's here in Silver Spring. So if you are able and willing to come, if you want to bring some friends, that would be great. So just let us know. You can let me know, or our organizer Lev, or Kathy, who's outside doing check-ins. Just let us know, and we would be really excited to have you. We will be sending an action alert tomorrow about this, so you'll see it in your inbox, assuming you're on our listserv, which you should be. But the action alert is about public input for maintaining the Little Falls Parkway Road Diet. So it's a really simple form that you can fill out online to submit public input. So we are trying to encourage as many members as possible to fill out that form in support of the road diet at Little Falls Parkway. Okay, let's see. During our meeting next month, where Council President Glass will be speaking, our nominating committee, consisting of Sunil Dasgupta and Ben Ross, will be announcing a slate for the board for next year. However, if you would like to be considered, let them know. And if you would like to nominate yourself, you're more than welcome to do that at our meeting next month. You can also nominate someone else, another member, so the election, that announcement and nominations will be during our December meeting, and the election will be during our January meeting. The board serves on a calendar year basis, so that will be for the 2024 year. Okay, lots of announcements. Before we get to our guest speaker, we typically do go around the room and quickly share your name and where you're coming from. If you are currently on the board of ACT, you can announce that as well. So, would you like to start?
Greg Sanders. So, the non-branch member of Silver Spring.
Timber, Bethesda. Sebastian Salvati from Bethesda also.
Ben Ross, Bethesda, and Chair of Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition.
Paul Golden, Silver Spring, and past president of that.
Barbara Sanders, Purple Line now, Woodside section, Silver Spring.
Bill Ferlino, Silver Spring.
Rodolfo Perez, Silver Spring. Chip Clemmer, College Park.
Campbell, Bethel. Ray Feldman, Community Outreach and Communications Team with the Purple Line Project.
Chris Broom, I live in Silver Spring.
Margaret Show from Germantown. I'm with the same coalition, Transit Alternatives to Mid-County Highway Extended, as well as being a member of this organization.
My name's Chris Farrell. I live in the Kent Mill section of Wheaton. I'm a board member.
Michael Larkin, Silver Spring.
Rank and file member.
John Slater, Silver Spring.
Simeon Duskett, Aspen.
Sean Orson, Gatesburg.
Tina Slater, Silver Spring, near the Waynedale Purple Line Station.
Awesome, thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Is this a little too much feedback, or is this okay? All right, cool. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this month. Delegate Marc Korman was first elected to the Maryland House of Delegates in 2014 and has been a great friend of the Action Committee for Transit. Earlier this year, he was named chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee, one of just 6 standing committees in the House. Prior to that, he served on the Appropriations Committee, where he previously chaired the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee and the Personnel Subcommittee. This year, he served as Majority Leader of the House of Delegates. Delegate Korman, it represents District 16, so he is the representative for several people here. And so with that being said, there's a lot more that he's done. He's been, again, a great friend of ACT and improving public transit. And so please join me in giving a round of applause to Delegate Marc Korman.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Amy. I want to congratulate Ben Ross on his role with the nominating commission. I know he's worked a long time to get a leadership role in ACT, and it's finally happened. So congratulations, Ben, on your leadership accomplishment. So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me back to be with you. You guys probably don't remember this, so I shouldn't out myself, but I had to cancel at the last minute for this meeting last year. So it's nice that you didn't totally disown me after that. And with forgiveness of my Jewish grandmother, I thought sort of the theme of my quick little talk here would be sort of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. Transit past, transit present, and transit future, and then really get to what you all want to talk about, which is obviously the most important part. So, on transit past, I'm talking recent past here. I know we have members of the Sanders family in this room, and obviously we can go back pretty far. But I just wanted to say the past few years, I think there's been some great success in Annapolis with transit and sort of the related issues of Vision Zero and transit-oriented development. I think we've got a lot of great things to be proud of that you all have really been a big part of advocating for. Obviously, I'm personally, quite proud of dedicated funding for Metro, and I got to shout out Sean Emerson, who was my aide in the year that managed to pass, and it's been really important to the rejuvenation of the Metro system and the reduction in track fires. Obviously, the Purple Line, which this group has formed to push forward, is under construction, and it's been in fits and starts, but it's happening. They're almost at the halfway point in sort of the technical accounting of project progress, and so that's really exciting. There's still a lot of work to do. It sounds like there's a representative for the project in the room, so I don't want to out anybody, but I think we're going to have more conversations about cost and schedule going forward. But the project is happening, which is very exciting. Around this time, 8 years ago, we were not sure it was going to go forward, and then Governor Hogan saw the light, so that's very positive. In Annapolis, a transit caucus was formed about 3 years ago to advocate for a lot of these issues. That's been very positive. We passed the Maryland Transit Administration Transit Safety and Investment Act to make sure that the Baltimore local transit system got the capital dollars it needed to rejuvenate itself, just as we did for the DC area metro system. We passed the Regional Rail Transformation Act from Delegate Solomon on MARC rail investment, so there's been some progress there with some work going on with the MARC rail system. We passed legislation for matching funds for the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit program. I know he's not here tonight, but I know you've had Gary Hodge here at many of your meetings. He's been working on that project to bring rapid transit to Southern Maryland for years. I'll say, as someone who has a committee member in Southern Maryland who invited me down there on a Friday night, it took me 3 hours to get down to Waldorf, driving down. It only took me an hour to get home, so I would have loved to have a transit alternative. For Vision Zero fans in the House, we've passed legislation from Delegates Marc and Delegate Charkoudian related to those issues. And we also, for the county, established a sort of continuous source of funding for bus rapid transit. So all that, sort of some past pretty positive progress and history that, we all share. And I know many of you have been a part of those efforts, as I said. So now I'll jump to sort of transit, present, which, is a mix of good and bad. On the good news front, I'm sure all of you saw this with this crowd, but, last week there was some exciting news from some federal grants from the big infrastructure bill for two projects important to the whole state when it comes to transit. The Frederick Douglass Tunnel, which is formerly known as the BMP Tunnel. Rehabbing that is going to be really important for Amtrak service into and through Baltimore for the Northeast Corridor, and then MARC Rail service on the Penn Line, and then also the Susquehanna River Bridge project, which is part of the necessary rehab to do the run-through service, not in Virginia, which we also care about, and the Long Bridge is needed for that, but run-through service to Delaware, because there's that gap in sort of the northeast corner of Maryland to Delaware. That's a big gap in commuter rail in the northeast corridor that we are working to fill with our partners in Delaware. Again, as I said, the Purple Line is continuing to progress. The governor has rejuvenated the Red Line program, and they're in the middle of a series of meetings now, wrestling with what exactly that will look like at grade, tunnel, what mode, bus rapid transit or light rail. And so those are good things in the present, but there's also some pretty significant present challenges. The financial picture for the State Department of Transportation is, you all don't really hear that feedback that Amy and I are hearing?
I hear it.
Okay. Do I need the mic for the camera? Is it necessary? Can you guys hear me without the mic?
Yeah.
Okay, great. This is way better. Awesome. Can I still be seen on the camera if I make myself more comfortable? Okay. So the financial picture of the Department of Transportation is extremely strained. And in fact, for the first time when the draft transportation capital budget was put in on September 1st, it was out of balance. Normally, the draft is put in balance along a 6-year plan for transportation spending. Now, sometimes the balancing is more honest than other times, right? They play there's a lot of budget gimmicks when you're putting together a budget, but they've never put something in that was just out of balance. And it was over $2 billion out of balance. But for fiscal year 25, which is the next fiscal year, it was only about $100 million out of balance. And I have to say, if you really want the deep dive on this, Sunil Dasgupta did a whole show on it. He had an amazing guest on it, so I really highly recommend listening to that if you want sort of the whole hour version of the transportation budget. But the governor and the department put in a draft budget for transportation capital that was out of balance. It's only gotten worse since then. It's sort of even more out of balance now. The Department of Legislative Services looked at it the other day and thinks it's closer to a $3 billion gap over the 6 years, including an over $500 million gap coming up for the next fiscal year, the next budget year that we're going to be dealing with, which is obviously hugely challenging if you want to do the next steps of a lot of those projects I mentioned that are supposedly moving forward. And this out-of-balance budget didn't even include a lot of the payment necessary for those projects. Just as an example, it didn't include the money we're going to need, and I'll talk more about this, to fill the WMATA operating budget gap that we're facing for next year, which, for me personally, I have a lot of transit priorities, but, I hate to, pick favorite children, but, making sure that the WMATA system continues to function and thrive, that is the backbone of transit, really in the state, in my view, but certainly in this region. And so it's great to talk about expansion and new things like Southern Maryland and the Purple Line, but without a functioning metro system, that's obviously fantastical. So, they didn't include funding for that, for example. So that's, a huge challenge that we have to deal with, and that's the present we're facing. And, I've been asked a lot, sort of, how did we get to this point? I mean, how did, the freewheeling liberal Democrats spend the money so quickly? We just had, Mr. Moderate Fiscal Conservative, Governor Hogan, and of course, the truth is more complicated than that. There's a lot of things that brought us to this current point. One is inflation. I mean, inflation is just a big part of it. The capital budget, which is the part we talk a lot about, is actually the third call on our transportation revenue, right? The first thing we do is pay off bonds, which is related to capital, because we issue bonds to pay for capital. Then we do all the operating expenditures of the department. And then we do the capital program, like build new train lines. Sorry to say it in this room, but widen highways, widen roads, whatever. Build bike paths, all of those things. That's like the third thing we do with our transportation revenue. Well, on the operating side, the capital too, but on the operating side, which is double the size of the capital budget, inflation's had a big hit on the budget, right? It's had a big impact on, everything from fuel costs to, what we pay bus drivers, all these other things. So that's a big driver. We've also asked the department to do some things that are expensive. They're important commitments, but they're expensive. We've asked them to transition the Maryland Transit Administration bus fleet to zero emission. We've asked them to put this increased investment, as I said earlier, into the MTA capital system. Obviously, we've asked for more money for WMATA. We've asked them to fund at the state level 2 urban transit systems. Basically, no one else does that, right? So in Maryland, unlike in Virginia, WMATA is entirely paid for at the state funding level. Now look, you're all the taxpayers, right? I don't think you really necessarily care if you're paying it to the county or the state and where the money comes from, but for the Maryland Department of Transportation, this is a really big deal. Because in most other places, it's either a shared commitment or almost entirely a local commitment. In Virginia, the WMATA payment's almost entirely local, right? There's a little bit of an add-on, a little kicker from the state, but it's almost entirely local. In Massachusetts, it's kind of like a cooperative arrangement between Boston and the state. In New York, it's a cooperative arrangement. We're unusual. We've kicked that all up to the state level. Maryland got that for WMATA in about 30 years ago. It's a commitment we made, and it's not good or bad. I mean, we can debate whether it's good or bad, but for my purposes, it's not a question of whether it's good or bad. It's just a funding reality that we have to deal with. Now, Governor Hogan also, did a pretty strategic job of getting shovels in ground on his favorite projects to use up a lot of infrastructure money on his way out the door. And so there's just not a lot of give there for the Moore administration to say, we don't really want to build this project or that project, because once the shovel's in the ground, it's pretty hard to say we're going to walk away from a project. And frankly, that's been part of my argument about the Purple Line. When the construction contractor walked away from the Purple Line, there were people in state government in Annapolis who said, well, let's just, throw in the towel here. And my view was, no, you don't take a scar in the middle of the road and just leave it. You finish the project. And so, I have to say, to be fair to my friends in Garrett County or wherever, if there's a road product that's 6 months into construction, I'm not personally in favor of pulling the shovels out of the ground and saying we're taking that money and putting it towards a different project. I think we have to see that project through. That's a commitment the state has made. So, these are obviously very big challenges we're facing in the present. As I said, WMATA is clearly a part of this as well. With the shortfall they're having, they're looking to Virginia, Maryland, and DC to pick up about $750 million more total in contributions for just on the operating subsidy side, and so that's a big challenge we're wrestling with, obviously related to the state's challenge. And the other sort of present action happening is the legislature, really at the insistence of the state Senate, set up what's called the Transportation Revenue and Investment Commission, and if you figure out the acronym, it's actually TRAIN. It's the TRAIN Commission. So good job by the Senate coming up with that acronym. And that group is meeting to talk about what we want to fund in transportation, and then how we're going to fund it. Because I think all of us can put together our list of favorite projects, but it gets a lot harder when we put together our list of favorite revenue sources. And so that commission is a 2-year commission. It's meeting now. We have an interim report due in January, and then a second report due the following January. I'm one of the House members on the commission, along with Delegate Chang and Delegate Feldmark from Anne Arundel and Howard County. From the Senate, we have Senator Gazzoni from Howard County. We have Senator Beidel from Anne Arundel County, and we have Senator Hershey from the Eastern Shore, along with a lot of other stakeholders, including members of the governor's cabinet. So that commission is meeting now. So now I'll do the Ghost of Transit future, the Ghost of Christmas future, which is what's going to happen with all of this. And I'm sure you all have questions about bills and things, and I'm happy to get to that. But this funding question is a big part of what we are facing right now, and all the great bills cost money, so we need to figure this out. The transportation budget that's going to come out from the department, I suspect, is going to be quite challenging and quite painful, and is going to put pressure on many things we all care about. I think it's going to potentially not fund the whole we need them to fund for WMATA, although maybe they'll step in and take care of that. And I think they are going to propose some service cuts to the Baltimore area system that are going to be very challenging for our allies in Baltimore. And many of you work very closely with transit advocates in Baltimore. Delegate Robin Lewis was like a celebrity at the ACT Gala on Saturday night, so I know you all are very aware of those issues. It's going to be put a lot of pressure on them because for the Department of Transportation, that's where a lot of the money is in the Maryland Transit Administration. They have a lot of direct control over that. So I think they're going to be proposing some very challenging cuts there. And there's going to be a lot of things we'd like to see them fund more firmly in the future that are not going to be funded. The state share of the Frederick Douglass Tunnel that I mentioned earlier, potential improvements to the Brunswick line, potential things on the zero emission transition are all things that may be sort of left by the wayside with this proposed budget. I will just say, going a little bit further into the future, it is just a proposed budget. It's the start of a conversation. And thanks to the voters of Maryland, the legislature actually has more control over the budget process now. And so it doesn't mean what Governor Moore hands down will automatically, go into effect. We will have the opportunity to make changes if this goes forward, as I'm sort of sitting here predicting right now. And I hope I'm wrong, by the way. I hope the budget that comes down doesn't look like I'm describing, and you can all say, man, Korman was way off with that prediction. That would be great. I would love for that to be that outcome. I'm just giving you my prediction of what's going to happen is that we're going to have a tough looking transportation budget that we are going to have to sort of roll up our sleeves and figure out how to fix. And that's going to be very complicated to do because, it'll be a revenue conversation. Yep, there's some money that can be had in cuts, and maybe there's a little bit more support from the federal government out there, although we can talk more about that if you're interested in your questions. But a lot of this is going to be on the state, on the revenue side to deal with, and we'll have to figure out if Marylanders and then the people you all elect to represent you want to have that conversation and do the things that we've talked about doing these past few years, or if we want to trim our sails. And so that's the conversation I think we'll be having during the next legislative session. We'll also be dealing with about 3,000 pieces of legislation, over 350 of which will be in the Environment and Transportation Committee that I'm not sharing, so I'm sure I'll see a lot of you there to testify on a regular basis. But with that, I wish I could come up with a brighter way to end this before turning it over to your questions, but I will just say that the gala was great on Saturday night. It was really great to see Cindy honored. I look back in my emails. I have emails from her from 2005 and 2006, getting me out there to hand out flyers on the Capitol Crescent Trail. And it's amazing how long ago that was, considering I'm like a newcomer to Purple Line advocacy compared to a lot of the folks in this room. So with that, look forward to taking your questions, and thank you all for your continued commitment to these issues and projects and causes. You want me to just call on people, or?
You can go ahead.
Sunil?
You said that the metro system is the backbone of the region, and there is shortfall, yes. Are you also thinking about sort of the long-term funding arrangement that Metro has, so we don't keep coming back to this? What is the possibility of redoing the compact?
So, Metro, a lot of you have heard me give this spiel so many times, so I hate to be repetitive, but Metro is just extremely complicated. Most systems are not structured like Metro. They're not multiple states. If they are multiple states, there's like a senior partner and a junior partner. We're in a really complicated place where we have 2 states, a city state, and then kind of the federal government, all at the table for governance and funding. We all do it differently, right? As I said, Maryland funds it from the state level. Virginia, it's local state split, I would say mostly local. DC obviously doesn't have that distinction, but they have various sort of council-mayor divides. The feds, which were hugely helpful in first building the system, and then in COVID, are not really at the table in the annual operating budget conversation, even though they have board seats as though they are. I'm not optimistic we're ever going to come up with like a cohesive, this is how the whole region is funding Metro kind of approach like you see in other places. I think we're always going to have some version of build the jurisdictions. Now, we can do more things like we did with the dedicated capital funding, where we put into law in each jurisdiction that dedicated funding to operate on a continuous basis. So they're not coming back for a new capital funding agreement on that piece every 2 or 3 years, seeking a new deal, right? That is a continuous amount of money. We need to probably rebase it and link it to inflation, but it's a continuous amount of money that we're not relitigating every year. So I think we can do things like that. But the way we did the capital funding is every jurisdiction did it its own way, right? DC, I think, funded it kind of out of the sales tax. Virginia, it was sort of a combination of their different funding sources. And in Maryland, even though Sean's idea was to fund it out of transportation revenue, it's mostly been funded out of the general fund by Governor Hogan, including, and now Governor Moore, including, using something called bond premiums, which it's too complicated to bother with here, but not funding it out of transportation revenue. I don't think we're ever going to get to the sales tax levied at a regional basis that all automatically goes to a model. I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's realistic, and I'm not against personally a regional sales tax in Maryland that helps pay Maryland's invoice from WMATA, but the idea that we're going to have just a regional sales tax and that money just gets sucked up by WMATA and used by WMATA and WMATA can live happily ever after, I just don't see that happening. I know we spent a lot of time in this region over decades talking about it, but to me, that's not the best way to spend our time. But I do think we can talk about things like the dedicated funding that can be longer-term solutions, so we're not just here every year talking about the same things again and again, and we can continue to tweak that. Is that going to happen between now and April when the Maryland General Assembly adjourns? I think most people are skeptical. I think that's why you've seen WMATA come up with sort of a short-term approach of a short-term amount of money they think they need sort of for the next year, so those conversations can continue. I will say, we, I think, had a great success last Tuesday with the election results in Virginia. I think that's going to make these conversations a lot easier to have, both the short-term and the longer term. They're still difficult, obviously. There's a lot, there's a limited amount of money, and there's a lot of, needs in both the Commonwealth of Virginia and the state of Maryland. But having a Democratic legislature in Virginia, I think, is going to be helpful going forward. Yes.
I think one issue in my mind is the need to increase ridership on public transit. I was looking at the recent Maryland's Climate Pathway report, and in the transportation section, it showed the passenger miles for different transportation modes, and it was really pitiful how little bus and rail contributed to the total passenger miles traveled in the state. And I think if we could increase ridership, that would not only help the environment, but it could possibly help the budget, funds for transit as well. And so I'm wondering, what are ways we can increase ridership?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, I mean, it helps for the system to have revenue. It also helps its political constituency. I mean, the more riders, the more people are saying we need to fund these things, we need to build these things, we need to do these things. Just thinking about Maryland as a whole state, WMATA, at least pre-COVID, had pretty good on the rail side, fare box recovery, the amount of revenue that's sort of going back into the system on the fare box. MTA in Baltimore never has really done that well. Their fares are lower. They've had other issues, but it still helps on the budget side. Right now, of course, we're starting from a little bit of a deficit because we're still not back to we're pre-COVID. Now, the places we are back are very telling. I mean, one, bus is basically back, both in Baltimore and DC, and I think most of us probably know the reason for that is a lot fewer choice riders on the bus than the rail, right? A lot more people who just have to ride it. That's the only way to get to work. That's the only way to get to school or whatever the situation is. But the other place we're doing really well in WMATA is on the weekends. Weekend service some days is better, ridership is better than it was pre-COVID. Well, why is that? I don't know for sure, but I think two of the reasons are parking is free right now on the weekends, and they've gone with a $2 flat fare on the weekends. Right? And one thing about Metro that we all know is that the fare structure is extremely complicated. So there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly it's both the urban and commuter rail system kind of mashed together, but the fares are really complicated and very off-putting to people. So I think that's two of the reasons that ridership is up, and I think this is very consistent with the current general manager's kind of philosophy of like, if you provide service, that will help with the ridership, right? People want to walk into the train station and see that there's a 5-minute or less wait for the train, and then they're going to walk in again the next day once they've had that good experience. So I think continuing to promote things like that. But I also think we should consider advertising, and even potentially, and I've actually sort of thought about this in the shower, so I haven't done the research yet, but there are these signs on the highway that tell us things like Amber Alerts or how much traffic is up ahead. Well, are we able to use those signs? Is it legal under the highway laws to use those signs to advertise that instead of sitting on 270, you could be sitting on the Brunswick Line train, right? So my office did a little bit of research on this last year to try to see if there was good like data on like how advertising helps ridership, and I have to say we couldn't find really great like direct like studies that showed this. So if anyone here wants to do a little extra research and help us with that, that would be great. But I agree with you. I think we need to get the ridership up. I think providing better service, clearly does that, and I'm hoping, advertising, and there's other incentives that we can do. We tried a few years ago to do a transit benefit incentive. Other places, do more on the negative side. They sort of penalize businesses for not having transit benefit incentives. A little complicated for us because we are so much more suburban. We've made efforts in places like downtown Bethesda, now North Bethesda to do the non-auto mode share goals, but it's just a little complicated because of our land use patterns. But there's definitely opportunity there. I agree with you.
The federal government has 75.
Yeah, federal government has a nice transit benefit. It's part of why WMATA's in trouble right now, though, because they've become so reliant on it. But yeah, no, it's huge having that incentive. Yes.
Is the percentage of your transportation budget for the state, is it increasing for transit instead of all for highway? Is some of that money as a percentage, is there a movement to increase transit?
Yeah.
Budget?
So what do you all think the percentage of the total transportation budget is for transit?
12%.
Any guesses? 12, 15? Okay. So on the operating side, it's over 50. And if you add operating capital together, and it ebbs and flows every year. If you add operating capital together, I think it's close to around 40, 42. So a little secret about Maryland, we actually spend a lot on transit. And we did that during the Hogan years too. Now, I think everyone in this room would probably agree with me that it's not enough, but we spend a lot on transit. In fact, we spend way more than a lot of the states that say we set up a dedicated fund for transit. We're dedicating X percentage of our transportation budget to transit. We don't do that in Maryland. We don't have a dedicated amount to transit, and we spend way more than those places with dedicated accounts. So, I think you're going to see some slight increases in a Moore budget versus a Hogan budget on transit versus highways, but even in the Hogan years, it was, there was a pretty significant amount of revenue going to transportation. Now, if you looked at, how there's a lot of ways to slice a dollar, right? If you look how capital was spent since the 2013 gas tax increase, that's a Pac-Man chart that looks mostly like roads versus transit. But year in and year out, it's pretty significant transit investment, but clearly not enough. Clearly we have to do more. And as I said, I expect the Moore budget will do more. There you go. It'll do more. It'll have more on the transit side. And I think you'll see on the cut side, the things he proposes to cut will be heavier towards some of the other modes than for transit as well. They do have a lot of investment in transit, a lot of control over transit. So as I said, I expect you'll see some cuts there too. But I think there'll be some pretty dramatic cuts announced in some of the other modes as well. And remember, it's not just highway and MTA and WMATA. We have one transportation trust fund that also covers the Motor Vehicle Administration and then the Port Administration and the airport. And then sort of off to the side is the Toll Authority, the Maryland Transportation Authority that does the tollways through the tunnels and the bridges and the ICC.
But as a follow-up and a finish, that's the operating budget. Can you speak on the capital improvements?
Yeah, this is off the top of my head, so Sean can correct me, but I think it's about 40% last year went to transit. So, yeah, I'd like to see that higher, but it's not the single digits that some people were shouting at and guessing. And that you've seen a lot of other states where a lot of other states, if you're Florida and you make the bold proclamation that you're going to dedicate 10% of your transportation revenue to transit, that's really great because right now they're investing a lot less than that in transit, right? But in Maryland, we're in a slightly different position. So clearly more is needed, and we're going to figure out how to do more. But I also, and I usually put this in the context of WMATA. I mean, how much do you all think we're spending on WMATA right now? It's just the state of Maryland, what Maryland contributes to WMATA.
300.
I think it's 600 or 700.
Anybody else? Okay, so two of the most informed guys in Montgomery County, right, just gave you guesses. This current fiscal year, it's about $850 million, just for WMATA. So it's a significant amount of money, and it's not enough because we want more people to ride, and it's good for our economy, and it's good for our environment, and it's actually good for traffic. But the investment is significant and has been. So in the current budget, it's significant money to you and I, but not significant in terms of building the red line. It's, you know, in the tens of millions of dollars that they have in there for the kind of planning, the planning work in sort of the lower part and the environmental review in the upper part. Now, obviously, the longer term is very different. Just as they don't fund the longer term red line project or the longer term Southern Maryland Transit project in their sort of 6-year capital improvement plan, they also don't show how the American Legion Bridge is going to be funded. Now, the scale of that investment depends on many things. It depends on if you do a public procurement, a public process, or a public-private partnership. You know, if you do sort of a traditional public procurement versus a public-private partnership. Both of those have costs, but a public-private partnership has less cost up front, frankly, if it's structured right. It still has a public contribution. At least every project that's been, almost every roadway expansion that's been done has required some kind of a public contribution. And then, of course, it depends quite a bit on federal funding. Right, the more administration is trying to move forward with federal funding, they're trying to get federal dollars. The scale of the federal dollars they get will help determine how much would have to be spent on the American Legion Bridge 270 if they go forward with it. So it just depends on a lot of factors. But it's a huge, I mean, allegedly it's one of the governor's priorities. But just like a lot of the other governor's priorities, like the Red Line, the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, we don't have sort of the clear path of how we get from here to there.
On the Brunswick line, you know, as we all know, it's an important ingredient in the conversation of how are we talking about adding lanes to I-270 when you have this resource running parallel to it. Last night at the Dog and Funny show of the toll lanes, I had a conversation with Enda about this topic because for the last 4 years, repeatedly, frustratingly, and insistent, I have asked NDOT, why don't you produce a calculation how many more rail cars I need, the headways, what do I need to make Brunswick line a resource to make a dent on the forecasted traffic growth along that corridor. And they say, well, it's CSX. They can allow. When I was reviewing the toll lanes and critiquing the Hogan plan, I look at the Cornerstone plan, which, by the way, you know, NDOT ignored completely because they say, you know, we need so many lines there, so many more lanes on I-270. No consideration to anything competing that. And if that plan had been implemented, it could take a dent of 40% of the growth in single occupancy cars from 2020 to 2045, which is the horizon for the toll lanes program. And in the documents of that plan says CSX is on board as long as the state foots the bill with, you know, the infrastructure necessary to make the Brunswick line, the resources need to put a dent on traffic. So, you know, I think it's, you know, I want to get this story straight. I mean, is CSX on board as the state, as long as the state makes the commitment to, you know, to do the physical infrastructure to put the Brunswick line where it should be, or is it that the story they told me yesterday, no, CSX would never allow that. So I get a conflicting story, and I want to fine-tune my argument to keep on hammering on this because, you know, we have been being ignored. I mean, for 4 years, we have asked, hey, we got it. You got interest that want more lanes on I-495, wants more lanes on I-270. As a taxpayer, as a civil engineer, give me a parallel analysis of competing alternatives. And unfortunately, we are here today and it's saying, well, we are going to proceed this because we got a record of decision. So, you know, to pursue those arguments, I would appreciate to have, like, what is the story with the Brunswick line? You know, so if we get those funds and the state steps to the plate, can we make the Brunswick line on a resource that would save
great question. So first of all, as a lot of you know, legislature's part-time. I'm an attorney during the day. Part of my work is representing railroads for the Surface Transportation Board. I have in the past represented CSX, never on an issue in Maryland, never on anything related to commuter rail. It's actually been a few years, but I always like to put that disclosure out there. Yeah, the Brunswick line. I think the good news is with the Moore administration, they are very communicative with CSX. They view this as a negotiating exercise. Whereas the previous administration didn't really want to spend a lot of time talking with CSX about the Brunswick line. In fact, when Greg Slater, who was Hogan's best transportation secretary, first took over as transportation secretary, it was right around when the big Virginia deal was announced with CSX, Norfolk, and the Commonwealth to do their big rail investment. And Secretary Slater said, I didn't even know I was allowed to talk to the freight railroads. So we've come a long way from there, where there's a lot of active negotiations. And because those are active negotiations, I can't really get too much into the details. I will say there are some obvious limitations where even if I had $30 billion or whatever the amount is to say I want to add just another line down in the right-of-way to run as many commuter rail cars as I want, there's just a physical problem in certain places, particularly once you're inside Silver Spring going into DC and the Union Station. There's just nowhere to actually do that kind of work. So it's not just a question of will we pony up the money for the infrastructure. There's also a question of how that infrastructure would work in certain places. But as I said, there are active negotiations. I think those negotiations are more in the vein of what can we do sort of next in the shorter term, as opposed to what is our ideal end state of having all-day service 7 days a week in both directions, which for me that is the ideal end state. It's more like, hey, can we do more on weekends? Hey, can we do more in the middle of the day? Hey, can we do a reverse train? And that's part of why you've seen MTA do some of these surveys to try to figure out what are people most interested in? What's sort of priority number one if there is going to be kind of a short-term understanding with CSX and some short-term changes? But I think one of the most promising things to me about the administration is that they are just extremely actively involved in negotiating with CSX on these issues. And also, they've put some people in place who just have a lot of experience working on some of these commuter rail issues. A lot of you probably know Drew Morrison. He used to work for Roger Berliner. He's been involved in commuter rail issues in this region for a long time. He's now working at the Department of Transportation. Joe McAndrew, who is the head of the Greater Washington Partnership and helped us a lot with Metro funding, was very involved in commuter rail in this region. He's now the assistant secretary at the department. So I think they've put a lot of great people in place and have sort of a lot of the right ideas for it, but because it's sort of active discussions, I can't really share more than that.
I understand there's a proprietary element to that. So the question is it an engineering challenge? See, because what I want to get set up clear in my mind so I keep hammering them on this issue, which I have corresponded with Joe McAndrew.
Yeah.
I mean, he responded by not responding.
Yeah.
So,
Is he running for office? I'll answer your question.
And so it's the thing is is there a possibility that, because I mean, it is essential into the conversation to rebut the argument, because I can see where you say, well, we're going to get incremental benefits, but then, I mean, but we are out in the rain because the highway people say, wait for that, we're going to add more lanes here and more lanes and more lanes.
I would just say, I think both things are true, right? So generally speaking, when you're dealing with commuter rail, it's almost always on a freight railroad line. In our case, we also have Amtrak for the Penn line to deal with. And it is the case that if the tenant shows up with money and says, I'd like to add a siding, they're going to say, great, spend your money, build your siding, as long as it doesn't mess with our trains, we're good to go, right? So I think that is the general sort of, broadly speaking, philosophy about how passenger and commuter rail has worked in this country with the freight lines, and in our case also with Amtrak on the Penn line. But it's also true that there are some places where the infrastructure is not possible. And so it's a more difficult question about, it's not just adding a siding in sort of a more rural part of the county, it's what do you do once those trains are inside the beltway and there's no space to add a passing siding, right? And so I think it's both. I think it's both of those things can be true at the same time. Yes, we need to show up to CSX and show that we're sort of a willing investing partner, but we also need to work through some of the really just difficult infrastructure limitation issues, because there's just some places where we can't do the things that in the ideal situation we would do, which is basically create parallel lines. Hope that answers that.
I have two questions. One relates to what Rodolfo was talking about, because my husband at the gala was talking to a man who was talking about building parking garage between the Shady
I spoke to
Grove
that guy.
Metro?
Yeah.
You spoke to him
I
too?
spoke to him.
And that would help, and I couldn't remember if he said it connected to the Mark line or to 270. But either way, it would help people, like if Mark from north of Shady Grove could go both ways, then the people would get on the Metro and they'd have availability all day long.
Yeah. I don't want to speak for the guy because he has patents, and I don't want to have an IP lawyer calling me, but I think the idea was a garage basically over 270 and an extension of the red line that would pick people up there. And, you know, it's a parking ride, right? So it's not, I mean, yes, he has patents, and I think it would be, sounds neat, but like, it's not like a new concept. I mean, Shady Grove is a distant parking lot, right, that runs people on a train into downtown DC. So we have, you know, models of this. And when the Amazon stuff was happening, HQ2, if you remember in the before times, before COVID, one of the concepts for our area was that there would be further out parking lots and then people would sort of take BRT in. So I think those ideas are out there. You have to make sure that the ride is convenient enough and fast enough that people are actually going to use it. Because you can come up with all sorts of crazy machinations of train rides to get places, but if you have to make 4 transfers and it takes 4 times as long as it does to drive, even in traffic, very few people are going to do it. And so I don't know that guy's numbers. I mean, he was eager to tell me about them, so I look forward to talking to him more. But concepts like that are not, I think some of his technology was new, but I think using elevators and things or whatever. But the concept of having people park far out and then, you know, commute in, I mean, that's what commuter rail is.
Yeah, but I think my impression from listening was that it would simplify the process, like you said.
Yeah.
Instead of having more delays, it would be a smooth connection. But
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'm open to innovative ideas. I also think, like to Rodolfo's point, we have a train line that runs basically alongside 270. Let's figure out how to use that. I mean, we don't necessarily need speculative new technologies when we have like things that have worked for a very long time that we could just do better. But that's my general bias.
So just to crystallize this argument, because it seems like what I'm trying to build the case is whether it is defensible to tell these people, I mean, before you add one more link right to 70, prove me that this parallel resource, and what I'm hearing from you is that there are a lot of difficulties that it looks like it would be a pie in the sky, and we do not have ammunition to press NDOT to produce a parallel analysis for the I-270 corridor. Because, I mean, with Hogan, you know, it was dead on the start. Screw you guys. This is highway D3 delivery. I don't want to see anything else.
Yeah.
We get now a guy, a paladin of sustainable development and democratic causes, etc. And it's like he's just picking up the program and he's telling, that's what McHenry just told me in the email. Sorry, it's too late. We got a record of decision. We have to go with what is on the table.
Yeah. So I mean, these are. I know. I see how you're linking them.
It's very frustrating. I mean, I'm an engineer. I mean, what is the physics of the problem?
Yeah. So
and last night, believe me, it was disrespectful. I'm trying to have a conversation. It's just a dog and pony show.
Yeah. So I want to let other people. I want to let.
Okay.
I want to let other people have a conversation also. So I'm going to respond to you, but then I'm going to let other people ask questions if that's okay. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot in what you're saying. I'll just say there's like a lot of overlapping things. I mean, clearly the governor has decided whatever he wants to do on MARC Rail, or Metro, or bus rapid transit, he's decided that he wants to do the American Legion Bridge and at least the connection of the American Legion Bridge to 270 and I guess the lower part of 270 because that's in the record of decision. So I think a lot of what they're trying to figure out is what can they do that is consistent with their record of decision. They don't want to restart the environmental review process. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that is clearly their position. They've stated that. And so that's what you're dealing with. So to me, if I was pushing for Brunswick Line improvements, which I do all the time, I would actually try to separate it a little bit from should this be an alternative to what you're trying to do on 270 to just say we should do this. It would be better for our region, traffic, environment, economy, if we had a better functioning Brunswick Line. Now then, there's the upper part of 270, right? So the record of decision doesn't cover north of Gaithersburg, essentially, right? North of 370, right? That environmental review process is just starting. So there is an opportunity to say, how does Brunswick line improvements act as an alternative to the road, project there? So I think in that segment, there's a little bit more of an opportunity to start at the beginning before there's a record of decision and say, can't we use Brunswick line improvements, that maybe plus other things, as part of the package here instead of it being a sidecar as I'm recommending you use for the whole power part. Yes.
Train commission needs to figure out funding. We've got a budget that isn't matching what we want to do. What are the kinds of things that we're approaching, that we're talking about instead of just gas, considering electric cars?
Yeah.
All the issues?
The two things that were spoken about at the last meeting that seem most likely in the short term are fees on zero-emission vehicles of some kind. So it wouldn't be a total replacement for their gas tax, contributions that they're paying the gas tax, but would be something. And not really in the Northeast, but most of the rest of the country, even blue states, to just make it as simplified as possible, have some type of fee on zero-emission vehicles to help with infrastructure costs. So I think that's one that you'll see likely in the short term. And the other one discussed was tolls. Using toll revenue for other transportation priorities outside of the toll kind of enterprise fund. This is a little complicated. I don't want to get too in the weeds here. Other states do this. New York does this. Pennsylvania does this. Virginia does it through their sort of P3 process. Maryland never really has, outside of loans. The Transportation Authority has given loans to other modes, but has never just sort of given them a check and said, now this is your money, go spend it on other things. That's what was being discussed the other day. Could we increase tolls and siphon some of that money off for other purposes? Now, some of that money is needed to reinvest into the toll facilities because Governor Hogan, his ever infinite wisdom, really great politician, liked winning elections, liked being popular, cut the tolls a couple of times. And that's money that they're now down. They took a bigger hit with COVID as well. They're now down for their kind of like maintenance budget, right? And tunnels and bridges and roads are expensive to maintain. So they need toll increases for that also. But the discussion we were having at the commission the other day was, could some of that money be siphoned off for other purposes? I actually had a bill like this a few years ago to raise the tolls and pump the money into what would be like a rail authority to do a bunch of the rail and transit projects we were interested in. So it's something similar to that. Those are two of the things that the commission has discussed so far. But there are a lot of other ideas out there that have, the commission's also discussed vehicle miles traveled. That is everyone's sort of favorite wonky idea. That's not going to happen before mid-April when the legislature adjourns. So we can talk more about that, but it's not a short-term one. There are other short-term ones that have sort of been, kicked around now. Other places are doing, they call them road impact fees on deliveries. Other places have add-on fees on Ubers, transportation network companies they're technically called. We have a local 25-cent fee, but we don't have a state fee on Uber or Lyft or whatever you might use to get to and from transit. 10 or 11 states do their trade-in vehicle excise tax exemption differently than us. When you go trade in your old vehicle and get a new vehicle, you pay the excise tax on the value of the new vehicle, except you can subtract the value of your trade-in. 10 or 11 other states don't let you subtract the value of the trade-in. That's $180 million a year, actually, in foregone revenue. None of these things are fun, and I doubt many of you will enjoy paying them. But these are the kinds of things that we can do to put together a package potentially to make some of the investments that we say we want to make. And again, there's also the ability to prioritize better in the existing budget and look at some of the projects a little bit differently. So I don't think it's all on the revenue side, but those are some of the things that the commission's discussed. Sir.
Participate.
Sorry. I was pointing to him and then I'll come right to you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I participated in the Right On Reimagine focus groups. I've been to some of their meetings about it. And one of the things that came up again and again during the focus groups and meetings afterwards, ideas that participants put forward, we heard from the consultants. A lot of ideas were contingent on what this would happen with Ramada or this here in Maryland, with Mark. And the big one, at least locally, BRT. A lot of ideas came out saying, well, kind of also think with BRT. BRT is, again, greenfield money coming from the state to help out. I could be wrong, that was my understanding. So one, is funding from the state the real constraint on accelerating the BRT? Two, what can the state do to try to prompt to move faster? Because you would think BRT, there's technical issues, but it could be faster to build out than a train.
So there has been a pretty significant contribution from the state. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, so I'll just say in the tens of millions over the past 2 or 3 years. We've used some of the state budget surplus for sort of one-time investments to give sort of grants to the county for their BRT, to Montgomery County specifically. And then a couple of years ago, when Baltimore City wanted additional funding for Canham Yards and M&T Bank, the Montgomery County legislators said, that's great, good for you, go teams, but we need money to be invested in bus rapid transit. So if you're going to get money from the lottery fund to pay wealthy sports owners, we want money from the lottery fund to invest in BRT. And so we passed a program that provides about $27 million a year in continuous funding for BRT. Right now, Montgomery County is the only county that qualifies for that money. But in the future, other counties can qualify, but we set a floor for Montgomery County that can't fall below. I think it's 20 million, maybe a little higher than that. So even as other counties, if we successfully expand bus rapid transit up 29 into Howard County will begin to qualify for BRT money, but we'll never fall below, I think, around $20 million. There was a little quirk in the funding for this year, just a quirk in how the bill was written, so the money won't start flowing until the next fiscal year. They got money last fiscal year, they'll get money next fiscal year, but they didn't get money this fiscal year. Now, if you're the county government and your goal is for the state to pay $500 million a year, yeah, there's a shortfall. The state's not paying $500 million a year, and I hate to be so cynical and negative, but the state is never going to pay $500 million a year for the county's BRT. Doesn't mean we can't do more, but it's never going to be as much as the county team wants, but the investment's been pretty significant. And I think the other thing they want, besides just money, is they want more flexibility in how they can get money, right? And that's a conversation around the train commission, to Barbara's question, which is, should we be giving the county governments more tools to raise transportation revenue themselves so they can do more of these things by themselves? And that's a model that Northern Virginia has. They do a lot of their transportation revenue raising through more local sources. And I know that's something Montgomery County is interested in. So it's an ongoing discussion.
So
Sir?
the help is, we gotta have more authority to do it on their own decision.
Well, I think it's a mix. I mean, I think, first of all, I think help is already coming. We engineered, a nice continuous funding arrangement that will continue, and we should continue to advocate for that to go up. I'm not saying it can't go up. I'm just saying it's never going to pay the full freight for the whole, 10 priority corridors. But I know that part of it is not just getting cash from the state, but also, at least from the county executive, I can't speak for the council. I know he's also talked a lot about they want authority to be able to raise more locally for these things as well. Sir, sorry, I cut you off.
Like Maryland has, like other states, has a state rail plan, but we don't seem to be following it. Then another thing I wanted to bring up is people that don't win all the time keep they bring up their stuff about. I see again that the guy that's doing magnetic levitation won in court, but he didn't get before. So he's getting more. He won a court case to have like this project for magnetic levitation. Now that's like a national issue. It's above you. It's not a state issue. It's like a national issue. Instead of the Amtrak running it, have like a state have a magnetic levitation train.
Right. So.
And he won in court.
Yeah. So I think he actually had a settlement with a development project in Baltimore City where the line was supposed to go. I'll just refer back to my earlier comments about technology we have versus more speculative.
Well, I don't want to have money spent on magnetic levitation.
Right. So I'll just refer back to the comments I made before about what I would focus on, which is, we have.
Saying there are other kinds of like.
I think I was saying the opposite. So I guess I'll be more explicit. We already have a train line, actually 2 train lines that run between DC and Baltimore. And I think we should spend time trying to make those work better. And that should be sort of the number one call out funding. Yeah, right. He had a settlement, yeah. Sir, Mr. Sanders.
So I think a long-standing wonky observation is that U.S. buying power for transportation capital is pretty terrible. I imagine probably something true for operating. Is there anything that as outside advocates we can be doing on that issue, either research or pressure, federal delegation, what have you?
Yeah. So the Trade Commission, you know, it's if you Google it, you'll find it. The meetings are streamed. I mean, they're open to the public also if you want to go to Annapolis. But the meetings are streamed. The materials are all online. They put up surveys every once in a while, so you can participate that way. So we'd welcome your involvement and thoughts on the presentations and what we're doing. I mean, I think the next meeting is going to be, you know, recommendation time on some short-term revenue options, and then discussing the possibility of a prioritization program. Some of you may remember 7 or 8 years ago, we had this big fight between the legislative and executive branches over project scoring. We did pass a project scoring mechanism to say we were going to prioritize funding for things with higher scores, similar to a Virginia model and a North Carolina model. Governor Hogan, you know, was not a fan, and we ended up compromising and watering it down. So we're discussing sort of bringing that back in a more robust form. So I think that's one of the short-term recommendations. I think the more interesting discussions will be next year as we get to the longer-term recommendations. And it's a great point about our sort of buying power, how we do project delivery. Some of it is just totally beyond anybody in this room's control. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, has a lot of great qualities and it protects a lot of important interests. It also is part of the reason the Purple Line is so many years behind. Right? We have to be honest about that. We may love it when it slows down a highway project, but I love it a lot less when you know, a judge in Chevy Chase uses it to, you know, put a hold on the record of decision. That is a big contributor in my, you know, limited view to how product delivery works in the United States. But there is something we actually can do in the state of Maryland, because another thing the studies have found is that the consultants and consultant costs are a big driver as well. So having more in-house product delivery capability and not having to rely on consultants for absolutely everything, I think would be one positive long-term way. And if you're doing one project, maybe it doesn't pay to do that. But if you're like people in this room and you want to be doing multiple projects going forward, we want multiple bus rapid transit lines, we want multiple MARC rail lines to see improvements, we want multiple light rail projects like the Purple Line and then the Red Line if it's light rail, and then potentially the Southern Maryland rapid transit system. But then it does make sense to have more of that in-house, which can save, you know, some funding, at least based on the studies that the literature I've seen. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about cost and timelines, and it actually ties very nicely into what you were saying. So my son is at University of Maryland as a freshman working on a short bike path, and he's looking at a multi-year process. He may not graduate before that little bike path is done. We see similar things with Purple Line. The Red Line is apparently going to have a new NEPA study, even though one has already been done. So I'm wondering if there's clearly a lot needs to be built, like for the energy transition, for transportation. Is there a possibility of Democrats building to a version of NEPA reform that they could love, that would make your life better?
Yeah, I mean, you have to call Jamie Raskin. It's a federal law. I mean, we have our own sort of baby version of it in Maryland, but it's, you know, largely driven by the federal process. So I mean, I think it needs some changes, but easy for me to say that when I'm trying to see the Purple Line built. You know, how am I going to feel a year from now when they're building some road I don't like, right? So I think it's complicated. It's a complicated question.
And with that, please join me in giving a round of applause to Delegate Korman. All right. Already made the announcements in the beginning of the meeting, but thank you again for coming. And if you could help us stack the chairs